Eleanor Marsh stood on the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands and watched her husband drive away. No argument, no final words. Just a rental car with Tennessee plates disappearing down a gravel road in November light. She held her coffee with both hands and let the quiet come back. 4 months earlier, she had stood at a different door, the front door of the house she had lived in for 34 years. Grocery bags in her hands, key in the lock. The key didn't turn. She tried it twice. The way you try something twice when your hands already know the answer and your mind hasn't caught up yet. Then she set the bags down on the porch step and sat there in the March sun and understood something she should have understood a long time ago. The man she had spent 38 years trusting had been planning this. Not just the locked door. Not just the divorce. Something older than that. Something that started with a piece of land in Kentucky she had inherited from her grandmother and never thought to look at too closely. She thought about it now. Her grandmother Vera had said something once, 6 years before she died, when someone had come asking about the lower fields. "They keep trying different doors," Vera had said. "They'll find I don't have different doors." Eleanor hadn't asked who they were. She wished she had. Eleanor Marsh had never been the kind of woman who made scenes. Not when Gordon missed Delia's high school graduation because of a client dinner he swore he had forgotten about. Not when he sold the lake house without asking her first, the one her parents had taken her to every summer, the one she had assumed they were keeping. Not when he spent 11 years building something she knew nothing about. She had always been the woman who handled things quietly, who processed, who organized, who wrote things down in a narrow-ruled notebook and worked through them one at a time until she understood them well enough to act. This quality had served her well in 38 years of marriage. It would serve her better now. She had filed for divorce on a Thursday in February. Not impulsively, not out of anger. Out of the particular exhaustion of someone who has finally stopped arguing with what she already knows. She had spent 3 weeks before the filing doing what she always did. Writing things down, looking at them clearly, asking herself whether she was sure. She was sure. Her attorney was a woman named Diana Crane, who worked out of a clean, quiet office on North Central Avenue in Scottsdale. Diana had the particular quality of someone who spends her days inside other people's worst situations and has learned to remain entirely steady inside them. She didn't perform empathy. She didn't lean forward with her head tilted at the right angle. She just listened and wrote things down and said what was true. Eleanor liked her immediately. The filing had not been a surprise to Gordon. He had been served on a Friday afternoon in late February. He had read the papers at the kitchen table while Eleanor stood at the counter making dinner. He had set them down carefully. He had not raised his voice. He had said he needed time to think. She had given him 3 weeks. What he had done with those 3 weeks she would not understand until the morning the key stopped working. It was a Tuesday in March. Early. The sun already sharp the way it gets in Scottsdale in March, bright and direct, and carrying no warmth yet. Eleanor had spent the previous day at her sister Margaret's house in Tempe. A quiet day. The kind of day she had been needing more of lately. Margaret made good coffee and didn't ask too many questions and understood that sometimes company means sitting in the same room doing different things. Eleanor drove home with 2 bags of groceries in the back seat. Bread, tomatoes, the good pasta Gordon had never liked but she had always loved, coffee beans for one. She pulled into the driveway of 4 Meridian Court and gathered the bags from the back seat and walked to the front door and put the key in the lock. The key went in. The key did not turn. She tried it once, then twice. The way you try something twice when your hands already know the answer and your mind is still catching up. Still insisting there must be a reasonable explanation. Jammed lock. Wrong key somehow, though it was the only key on the ring. A problem with the mechanism that could be fixed with a locksmith, and an hour and a reasonable amount of money. She stood on the porch step and looked at the key in her hand. Then she set the grocery bags down on the porch she had swept every Saturday morning for 34 years, and sat down beside them and looked out at the yard. The bougainvillea along the south wall was in full color, the deep reddish orange it turned every March. She had planted it in 2004 because her grandmother Vera grew the same variety along the fence of her property in Kentucky, and Eleanor had always loved it, had loved the way it looked against the pale stucco, had loved that it came back every year without being asked to. She sat there for several minutes. Then she took out her phone and called Gordon. He didn't answer. She called again. Still nothing. She sat on the porch step in the March sun with 2 bags of groceries and the key that didn't work and the particular silence of a phone that rings and connects to nothing. And she understood with the clarity that comes only when something has been made completely undeniable that this had not been an accident. Gordon had changed the locks during active divorce proceedings, while the filing was 3 weeks old and the ink on nothing was yet dry. He had changed the locks of a house that was titled in both their names and had been since 1991, and had done it while she was at her sister's. Without a phone call, without a message, without anything. She did not cry. She had done her crying 6 weeks earlier in the private and specific way of someone who understands that grief has a season and that the season was ending, and that what comes after grief is something more useful. She had given herself that week. She was done with it. What she did instead was call Diana Crane. Diana answered on the second ring. Eleanor told her what had happened in the order it had happened. The groceries, the key, calling Gordon twice. She told it without editorializing one fact after the next. Diana listened. Then she said, "What he did is called unlawful exclusion. He does not have the legal right to restrict your access to the marital home during proceedings. I'll file an emergency motion this afternoon." "How quickly will a judge look at it?" "Days." Eleanor looked out at the yard, at the bougainvillea, at the garden she had planted and tended for 34 years, that she was sitting outside of because someone had decided she no longer deserved to walk through the front door. "File it," she said. She spent 2 nights at a hotel on Camelback Road. Room 114. Small desk by the window. Industrial carpet, perfectly adequate for the purpose. She sat at that desk both evenings and did what she always did when something required understanding. She opened the narrow ruled notebook she kept in her bag and wrote down everything she knew. She knew the house was in both their names. She knew Gordon did not act without calculating what an action would produce. She knew that a man who had practiced controlled behavior for 38 years does not become impulsive in the 3rd week of a divorce filing. He becomes more deliberate, every move made because it was supposed to produce something. So she wrote down the question that mattered. What was the locked door supposed to produce? She didn't have the answer yet. But she had learned in 38 years of managing a household and a marriage and a life alongside a man who had turned out to be someone other than she had believed that the right question written down at the right moment has a way of pulling the answer toward it. She closed the notebook. She set her phone to wake her at 7. She slept. The emergency motion went through on Thursday morning. Diana called at 11:14. The judge had reviewed it that morning with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen unlawful exclusion before and had limited tolerance for it. Gordon was required to restore Eleanor's access to the marital home immediately. A locksmith sent by Diana's office met Eleanor at 4 Meridian Court at 2 in the afternoon and had a new key cut and in her hand by 2:30. She stood inside the house after the locksmith left and walked through each room slowly, not looking for anything specific, just looking. The kitchen was clean in the way Gordon kept things clean when she wasn't there. Surfaces wiped down. The dish towel folded the short way instead of the long way she had always folded it. the fruit bowl empty because he had never thought to fill it. She walked through the living room, the bedroom, her own bathroom where everything was as she had left it untouched. Then she reached the office. Gordon's office was a room she had walked in and out of freely for most of their marriage. A room where she had dropped off the mail and retrieved the stapler and refilled the paper tray on the printer without thinking about it. The way you move through rooms in your own home without registering that you move through them freely. She tried the handle. It didn't move. Not the standard door handle with a simple push-button lock on the inside. This was different. A keyed interior lock, the kind that required a small separate key. She looked at the door frame and saw what she was looking for. A slight variation in the paint around the lock plate. Fresh. The old hardware had been replaced recently. Recently enough that the paint hadn't fully settled back. She stood at the closed door and looked at it for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and photographed it. The door, the frame, the lock plate, the variation in the paint around the edges. She photographed the gap between the new hardware and the faint outline where the old hardware had sat still visible if you were looking for it. She was looking for it. She sent the photographs to Diana without explanation because she trusted that Diana would understand why they mattered. Then she went to the bedroom and pulled her large suitcase from the top shelf of the closet and began to pack. She had already decided she was going to Kentucky. The decision had come to her at the desk by the hotel window on the first night when she had written Vera's name at the top of a new page and then written the word land beneath it, and then sat for a long time thinking about a phone call from 6 years ago that she had not paid enough attention to at the time. Vera Whitmore had been Eleanor's maternal grandmother. A precise woman, practical in the specific way of people who have lived alone on a piece of land for a very long time and have learned that precision is not a luxury. It is what keeps things standing. Vera had owned 310 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky for most of her adult life. The land had come through her mother, who had received it from her parents, farming people who had worked the hill country for 2 generations before that. Vera had never farmed it commercially. She had lived on one end of it in a house she maintained herself until she was no longer able to, and she had refused through 4 decades of offers and one quietly persistent campaign of pressure that Eleanor had only partially understood until recently to sell any of it. When Vera died 4 years ago, the land passed to Eleanor, her name only. Specified in Vera's will with the particular deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing and why. Solely. The word had sat on the page with a weight Eleanor had noticed but not fully examined at the time. She was examining it now. She found the will in her personal documents folder in the filing cabinet on her side of the bedroom. She photographed it. Then she found the title paperwork she had filed away 4 years ago and had not opened since. 310 acres recorded in the Harlan County Clerk's office. Eleanor Jean Marsh listed as sole owner. She photographed that too. Then she thought about the phone call. 6 years ago, a Tuesday evening, Vera calling the way she always called at 6 o'clock after the evening news because she believed in routine and in not calling during dinner. Vera had said someone came about the land again, the lower fields this time, not the whole property, just the lower 200 acres. Eleanor had asked if it was the same man who had come 2 years before. Vera said it was a different man from a different company, but the same interest, the same language, the same careful way of not mentioning how much they already knew about the property. Eleanor had said, "What did you tell him?" Vera had said what I always tell them, that the land isn't for sale. And then Vera had said something Eleanor had carried loosely for 6 years without pressing on it. "They keep trying different doors. They'll find I don't have different doors." Eleanor had asked, "Do you know who they are?" And Vera had paused, a brief pause, the kind that means something is being decided about how much to say. She had said, "I know," but now is not the time. Eleanor had let it go. She had trusted the pause. had trusted that if Vera said now was not the time, there would be a time, and that Vera would tell her when it arrived. And then Vera had gotten sick, and then Vera had died. And Eleanor had been so occupied with the grief and the arrangements and the 4 years of ordinary life that had followed that she had not circled back to the question she should have circled back to. Who were they? She was circling back now. She was loading the suitcase into the trunk of her car when Diana called. Eleanor set the suitcase down and answered. Diana's voice had its usual quality: level, precise. The tone of someone who delivers information and allows the recipient to react without performing a reaction herself. She said, "Discovery from the office has produced something you need to know about." Eleanor waited. Diana said, "Among the documents recovered from Gordon's business files, there is a proposal document, dated 18 months ago. It outlines a mineral rights acquisition for 200 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, the lower fields of a property registered to you." Eleanor said nothing. Diana said the document has a signature line, "The transferring party. Your name is printed on it." Eleanor looked at the back of her car, at the suitcase she had just loaded, at the driveway of the house she had lived in for 34 years. She said, "I have never seen that document." Diana said, "I know." She said, "I have never signed anything related to that land." Diana said, "I know that too." A pause. Then Diana said, "Eleanor, this is not a divorce case anymore." Eleanor closed the trunk. She got in the car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and looked through the windshield at the house and the bougainvillea and the front door she had just had, the locks changed on for the second time in a week, and thought about what Diana had just told her. A proposal document, 18 months ago, her name on a signature line she had never seen. Gordon had been planning this before she had filed for divorce. Before she had called Diana. Before the conversation she had had with herself 6 weeks ago in the long quiet of a marriage finally going still when she had made the decision she had been building toward for longer than she had admitted. He had been building something too. Longer. With more patience. And considerably less conscience. She backed out of the driveway and drove east out of Scottsdale without looking back at the house or the bougainvillea or any of it. She drove through the afternoon and into the evening with the radio off. She tried music for the first hour, scrolled through stations without finding anything that matched the quality of what she was thinking, turned it off, and drove in silence through New Mexico and into Texas with the road and her own thoughts for company. This was not uncomfortable. She had always been someone who could sit inside silence without needing to fill it. A quality Gordon had found strange in the early years of their marriage and had eventually stopped remarking on. She stopped at a motor lodge outside Amarillo at 11:15, ate a gas station sandwich, slept for 5 hours in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and was perfectly adequate for the purpose, was back on the road by 5 in the morning with a paper cup of coffee from the lobby and the particular alertness of someone whose mind has been working through the night even while the body rested. The landscape changed as she moved east. The flat, open expanse of the Texas Panhandle gave way to Oklahoma, and then to the greener hills of Missouri, and then to the mountains of Kentucky. And with the mountains came something she had not expected. Recognition. Not the intellectual kind, the physical kind. A knowledge in the body of the way the road curved and the way the tree line sat against the ridge and the particular color the sky turned in the late afternoon above the eastern Kentucky hills. She had spent summers here as a child, long unstructured weeks at Vera's property when school was out. She had not thought about those summers in years. They came back to her now, not as memories exactly, but as something more physical, something her body had kept filed away in a place her conscious mind didn't often visit. She turned off the main road onto a county route, not from the GPS, from remembering. The GPS had wanted her to go a different way. She had ignored it and taken the turn she remembered, and the turn had been correct. This small thing steadied her in a way she could not entirely explain. The property came into view at 4:40 in the afternoon. She pulled to the side of the gravel track and sat with the engine running and looked at it through the windshield. The house was standing. This was the first thing she registered. The most important one. She had driven 15 hours, carrying in the back of her mind the quiet fear of arriving to find something beyond repair. Something so far gone that the trip itself would become a different kind of loss. But the house was standing. It was in poor condition. She could see that from the car. The porch roof had partially collapsed on the right side. Several windows were dark with grime, and one on the ground floor was cracked through from corner to corner. The siding needed work. The yard had been taken over by tall grass and a spread of blackberry cane that moves into unattended land in this part of Kentucky with a determination that is almost impressive. But the walls were straight. The chimney was intact. The main roofline held. She got out of the car and walked to the front door and stood on the porch testing each board before she put her weight on it. Most held. 2 near the right side gave under her foot in a way that told her they needed replacing soon, but hadn't failed yet. She found the key in the front pocket of her bag. The key Vera's attorney had mailed her 4 years ago, along with the title paperwork. The key she had put in her bag 4 years ago and had carried there ever since, without thinking about why she kept it so close. The lock was stiff. She worked it with the patience of someone who has learned that most resistance yields to patience rather than force. After a long moment, the mechanism gave. The door opened inward on hinges that groaned but held. The smell of the house came out to meet her first. Closed wood and old fabric, and something underneath that was specific to this house and to her childhood. A smell she had not encountered in decades. Her body recognized it before her mind caught up. She stood in the doorway and let it settle around her. Then she stepped inside. The front room held Vera's furniture exactly as it had been. The wide wooden rocking chair by the window where Vera had sat every evening. The bookcase along the far wall still full. Paperbacks swollen with humidity but standing. The braided rug Vera had made herself over 2 winters in the 1970s still on the floor, faded but intact. Eleanor set her bag down on the rocking chair and stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. Vera had been gone 4 years. The house felt less like abandonment and more like pause, as though it had been waiting with the reasonable confidence of something built to last and knowing it. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the back fields, the lower acres rolling away toward the tree line. 200 acres. The lower fields. The same 200 acres that had appeared on a proposal document 18 months ago, with her name on a signature line she had never seen. She stood there for a long time. Then her phone rang. Delia. Eleanor's daughter had been calling every day since Eleanor left Scottsdale. Each call Eleanor had answered and told her what she knew in the same clear and complete way she had always communicated with Delia. But this call was different. Delia said her name. Then she paused, in the way you pause when you have been rehearsing something and are deciding at the last moment whether to say it. Eleanor waited. Delia said Dad called me. Eleanor said when. Delia said 3 days ago, and again yesterday. A pause. Delia said, he said the lawsuit is going to destroy everything. He said you're acting out of emotion. He said the property in Kentucky is complicated and that you don't fully understand what's involved. Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at the lower fields going golden in the late afternoon light. She said, what did you say to him? Delia said, I told him I needed to hear your side, which was not nothing, which Eleanor acknowledged internally and set aside. She said, Delia, I want you to do something for me. Delia said, "Okay." Eleanor said, "I want you to ask your father one question. Ask him why the office was locked with a new key lock. Ask him what was in that room that needed a separate lock that wasn't there before." Silence. Delia said, "Mom." Eleanor said, "Just ask him and listen to how he answers." She said it without pressure, without edge, the way you say something when you are confident enough in the truth to let it do its own work. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen of Vera's house with the evening coming in through the window and the lower fields going dark at the edges and the cedar chest visible through the doorway of the back bedroom exactly where Vera had always kept it. She would open it in the morning. Tonight, she would eat something simple from the groceries she had brought and sleep in the back bedroom and let the silence of this place settle around her the way it used to when she was 8 years old and the summers were long and she had no idea yet what she was standing on. She pulled her sleeping bag from the car. She made a simple meal. She slept without difficulty. She woke before sunrise to the sound of birds in the tree line, a particular quality of silence that belongs to rural Kentucky in the early morning. Not empty, full of small sounds that city living trains you to stop hearing. The creak of the house adjusting to the morning air. The distant sound of something moving in the lower fields. She lay still for a moment and listened. Then she got up and went to make coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the light come across the lower acres and thought about what Vera had known and what the cedar chest at the foot of the bed was still holding. The cedar chest had been at the foot of that bed for as long as Eleanor could remember. Dark wood. Brass fittings gone green at the edges. The initials VW pressed into the top panel in letters that had softened over decades, but never disappeared. Vera Whitmore, who had packed that chest herself sometime in the 1960s, and had added to it and organized it and reorganized it across 60 years of living alone on this land, with the particular attention of someone who understood that the things you keep are the things that will speak for you when you are no longer there to speak. Eleanor had slept in this room every summer from age 6 to age 14. She had sat on the edge of that bed and read paperbacks and braided her hair and listened to Vera moving around in the kitchen, making breakfast. She had looked at that chest 1,000 times without ever thinking about what was inside it. She was thinking about it now. She finished her coffee standing at the kitchen window, watched the light finish coming across the lower fields, the grass still heavy with dew, the tree line at the far edge catching the first real color of the morning. 200 acres, right there, rolling away from the back of this house like they had always rolled, like they had been rolling since before anyone in her family had words for what was underneath them. She set the cup in the sink, walked to the back bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the chest. The small padlock was where Vera always kept it, snapped shut through the brass loop on the front, and the key was on the same ring as the house key, labeled in Vera's precise handwriting on a small paper tag. Cedar, one word. No explanation needed because Vera had never believed in using 2 words where one would do. The padlock opened on the first try, which surprised her. She had expected resistance. Everything in this house had required a certain amount of patient negotiation. The front door, the kitchen window that stuck in its frame, the faucet in the bathroom that needed to be turned at an angle before it would agree to run. But the padlock opened cleanly, as though it had been waiting for this specific moment and had decided not to make it difficult. Eleanor lifted the lid. The smell came first. Cedar, obviously. Underneath it, something older. Paper and time, and the particular dry quality of things that have been kept carefully in a closed space for decades. She looked at what was inside. organized. Of course, Vera would never have left a chest in disorder. Everything in labeled envelopes or folders or rubber-banded bundles with small identifying tags in that same precise handwriting. Insurance documents going back 30 years. Property tax records each year in its own envelope, oldest at the bottom, most recent near the top. A folder labeled Deed in blue ink. Family photographs. Multiple envelopes. Each one labeled. The handwriting on the oldest ones slightly different, younger, from an era when Vera was still figuring out who she was going to be. One envelope labeled Margaret and James, 1959, her great-grandparents. She had never seen photographs of them. She held the envelope for a moment without opening it. Another labeled Ruth, which was Eleanor's mother's name. Inside that one, her mother's birth certificate. A photograph of her mother as an infant wrapped in something white, held by a woman Eleanor recognized from other photographs as Vera at perhaps 30 years old. Young, certain-looking, the way Vera had always looked, like someone who had already decided the important things and was getting on with living. Eleanor put the photograph back carefully. She worked through the chest with the methodical attention Vera had modeled. One thing at a time. Examined, understood, set aside, or replaced. Near the bottom, she found Vera's marriage certificate from 1961. Harold Whitmore. Vera Eugenia Calloway, before she became Vera Whitmore. Eleanor hadn't known Vera's middle name was Eugenia. Hadn't known her maiden name was Calloway. There were whole rooms inside a person that you never visit even when you love them, even when you think you know them well. She sat with that for a moment, and then her hand found the envelope at the very bottom of the chest. Under everything else, placed there deliberately, she understood immediately. Not filed with the other documents, not labeled with a category. Set apart. Below the deed, below the tax records, below 60 years of careful documentation. A single envelope sealed, thick, more than one document inside. And on the front, in Vera's handwriting, a name. Eleanor Jean Marsh. Not Ellie, not Eleanor. Her full legal name. The name she had taken when she married Gordon 38 years ago. The name on her driver's license and her passport and every official document she had signed as an adult. Vera had chosen that name deliberately, had written it deliberately, had wanted there to be absolutely no question about who this envelope was for. Eleanor held it, just held it. She was aware of her own breathing, of the birds in the tree line, of the morning light moving across the floor of this room where she had slept as a child, without knowing what her grandmother was sitting on. Then she opened the envelope. 4 documents. She laid them out on the bed in the order she found them. The first was a letter. Vera's handwriting. 2 pages, front and back. Dated 8 months before she died. Eleanor knew that date because she had memorized it the way you memorize the date someone dies. It sits in your mind with a particular weight. And to see a letter dated 8 months before that date meant Vera had been planning this while she was still well enough to hold a pen steadily. While she was still Vera in the fullest sense. Clear, deliberate, saying exactly what she meant to say. Eleanor read it slowly. Vera wrote that 6.5 years before she died, a man had come to the property. Not the first man to come about the land. There had been others over the decades, but this one was different in a way she had not immediately understood and had only come to understand later. He represented a company called Meridian Land Acquisitions. He was interested specifically in the lower 200 acres. Not the house, not the full property, just the lower fields. He had made a substantial offer. Vera had declined. She had declined every offer. That was simply not something she did. 4 months later, a second man came. Different name, different company. Crestfield Resources. Same interest, same fields, slightly different language. Higher number. Vera wrote, "I recognized the approach because I had seen it before from others over the years. Change the name. Change the face. Keep the target." And I had always simply said no and waited for them to move on. But this time, she had not simply said no and waited. This time, she had hired a private researcher in Lexington named Patricia Old, who specialized in corporate entity tracing. She had given Patricia the names of both companies and both representatives and asked her to find out who was behind them. Patricia had delivered her report 6 weeks later. Both companies traced to a single individual. Vera had written his name at the bottom of the first page. Gordon Allen Marsh, underlined once. Eleanor looked at the name for a long time. She was aware of something moving through her that was not surprise. It was the sensation of a thing you have been approaching from a long distance finally becoming visible. Not new, just clear. Finally clear. She read the rest of the letter. Vera wrote, "I did not tell you because I did not want to be the person who broke your marriage based on what was at that point a business inquiry. A dishonest one, a cowardly one, but a business inquiry. I had no way of knowing what you knew or didn't know. I had no way of knowing whether you and Gordon had discussed the land and whether what I was seeing was something you were part of or something being done to you. So I watched. I declined every approach. I made sure the land was protected. And I waited to understand more before I said anything to you." She wrote, "I watched Gordon at the funeral. Do you remember that afternoon? You were managing the arrangements and the relatives and doing what you always do, which is hold everything together so quietly that no one notices you doing it. Gordon took a walk with a man he introduced as a business contact who happened to be nearby. They walked the lower fields for an hour and a half. I watched them from the kitchen window. I knew then that this was not a business inquiry that had ended when I declined. It was a plan that was still in progress. So I made a plan of my own." Eleanor turned to the second document. A geological assessment, conducted by an independent firm in Lexington, dated 5.5 years ago, commissioned by Vera privately after she received Patricia's report. 23 pages of technical language, careful and precise, with maps and diagrams and the measured vocabulary of scientists who are professionally cautious about what they claim. Eleanor was not a scientist, but she could read, and she read this document carefully the way she read everything that mattered. Twice, through beginning to end, not skipping the technical sections, even when the language was dense. What the document described was significant. The lower 200 acres of the Whitmore property in Harlan County contained mineral deposits, rare earth elements, specific concentrations in the alluvial layers of the lower fields that the assessment described with the careful hedging of professionals who do not want to overstate and who do not need to, because the underlying finding is clear enough without emphasis. The concentrations were substantial. The specific composition included elements that had become in the years since this assessment was conducted considerably more strategically important. Components used in battery technology, in domestic supply chains that the American market had spent the past decade trying to rebuild from the ground up. What had been valuable 6 years ago was now something more than that. Eleanor sat with this for a long time. She thought about Gordon, about the 8 years the documents would later reveal he had spent building toward this, about the tidy, controlled way he moved through the world, the way he researched things quietly and acted only when he was certain, the way he had sat across from her at 38 years of dinners, knowing what was underneath the land her grandmother was protecting. She thought about the patience that required, and she felt underneath everything else a cold and specific understanding of what her marriage had been. Not in all of it, not in every year, but in the layer of it she had never been shown. She turned to the third document, a letter from Vera's attorney confirming that the property had been placed in a protective land trust 5 years before Vera's death. Eleanor named as sole beneficiary. The structure of the trust, designed specifically to prevent any transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property without Eleanor's direct written consent, regardless of any other legal proceeding, regardless of any other claim. Gordon could not have gotten to this land through the divorce, not even if he had tried. He had not known about the trust. Vera had made sure of that, had changed nothing in her behavior toward him, had accepted his calls on holidays, had sent Christmas cards, had given him no indication that she knew what he was doing, because she understood, as Eleanor was only now understanding, that the most effective protection is the protection the threat doesn't know exists. The fourth document Eleanor did not open yet. She could see it was a photograph, the outline of it through the paper. She put it aside. There was a reason she wasn't ready. She couldn't have explained the reason, but she had learned to trust the things she couldn't explain. She folded the letters carefully, placed all 4 documents back in the envelope, sat on the edge of the bed in the room that had been hers every summer for 8 years of her childhood, and looked at the cedar chest, and at the window, and at the lower fields visible through the glass, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. The anger was there. She acknowledged it the way you acknowledge weather. It was present. It was real. It was going to require some amount of time and attention. But what she sat with first was something older and more specific. Grief for the shape of what had been hidden, for the years of dinners and conversations and the ordinary accumulation of a shared life, all of it happening in the foreground while something else was being built in the background. For the trust she had extended without knowing she was extending it over a gap that wide. And underneath the grief, something else, something that was just beginning to take shape. She picked up her phone and called Diana. Diana answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. Eleanor said, "I found something. You need to see all of it." A pause. Diana said, "Describe it." Eleanor described it. The letter, the names of both companies, the researcher in Lexington, the name at the bottom of the page, the geological assessment, the land trust. Silence. Then Diana said, "I'm coming to you." Eleanor said, "You don't have to do that. I can photograph everything and send it through the portal." Diana said, "I know I don't have to. I'm coming Saturday." Eleanor looked at the lower fields through the window. She said all right. She spent the rest of that day working, because working was what she did when something needed to settle before she could see it clearly. She moved through the house room by room the way Vera had always worked. One thing finished before the next thing started. She swept every floor twice. She opened every window that would open. She found Vera's cleaning supplies in the cabinet under the kitchen sink. The same brand of floor soap Vera had used as long as Eleanor could remember, still half full in its brown bottle. The smell of it undid her for a moment. Just a moment. She stood in the kitchen, holding the brown bottle, and breathed carefully, and then got on with it. Walt Briggs came that afternoon. He was 60 years old, and had the particular quality of someone who has worked with his hands his whole life in a specific geography and knows that geography the way other people know their own faces. The woman at the Harlan County hardware store had given Eleanor his number that morning when Eleanor went in for cleaning supplies and mentioned she needed someone to look at the porch roof and the siding. The woman had said, "Walt Briggs. Don't bother calling anyone else," and had written the number on a paper bag and handed it across the counter with the confidence of someone whose recommendations have always turned out to be correct. Walt pulled up at 2 p.m. in a truck that had seen serious work and was not ashamed of it. He got out, looked at the house, and then looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone who is placing a face against a memory. He said, "You're Vera's granddaughter." Eleanor said, "I am." He said, "She talked about you." She said, "What did she say?" He considered this with the unhurried quality of someone who does not say things carelessly. He said, she said, you were the one who paid attention. Out of everyone, you were the one who actually listened. Eleanor thought about the phone call 6 years ago, about the pause she had not pressed on, about the question she had not asked. She said, I should have paid more attention sooner. Walt looked at the house, at the collapsed section of porch roof, at the north face siding where weather had been getting in. He said, let's see what we've got. They walked the property for 2 hours. Walt moved slowly and deliberately and spoke rarely, but when he spoke, it was useful. He found 3 things Eleanor had missed. A section of foundation on the east side that needed pointing before winter. A place where water had been coming in behind the north face siding and had softened the underlying structure in a way that was not yet critical, but would become critical if it wasn't addressed before the first hard freeze. A problem with the chimney flashing that explained why the back bedroom fireplace had been drafting cold air. He produced a list. Porch roof first. Then the cracked window and the 2 failing boards. Then the north face siding. Then the foundation pointing and the chimney flashing before the weather turned. The interior was in better shape than the exterior suggested. The kitchen was sound. The plumbing needed 1 repair. The heating system needed servicing. He said it's a good house, built right, just needs someone paying attention to it again. Eleanor looked at the house, at the straight walls and the intact main roof line and the porch that had partially given way, but had not given way entirely. She said, can you start Monday? He said, I can start Monday. Delia called that evening. Eleanor was eating a simple dinner at Vera's kitchen table. The window open, even though it was cool now because the sound of the evening coming in was something she had forgotten she needed. She answered on the second ring. Delia said her name. The way you say someone's name when you are leading somewhere. Eleanor set down her fork. Delia said I asked Dad about the office. Eleanor waited. Delia said he said it was business documents, sensitive client files, that he needed to secure them during proceedings. Pause. Delia said, and then he said something else. Eleanor said what? Delia said, he said the Kentucky property is complicated. He said you inherited something you don't fully understand. He said he was trying to help you manage it appropriately. The word appropriately sat in the air between them. Eleanor said Delia. Delia said, I know. She said, I know how that sounds, Mom. I know. But he sounded so... She stopped. Eleanor said what? Delia said convincing. He has always sounded convincing, which was true. That was the thing. That was exactly the thing about Gordon Marsh. He had always sounded convincing. In 38 years, Eleanor had watched him be convincing in boardrooms and at dinner parties and in conversations with contractors and attorneys and his daughter on the phone, and she had almost always taken it at face value because she had been married to him and had believed she knew the difference between Gordon performing and Gordon telling the truth. She was less certain about that now. She said, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it on your own, not through your father. Delia said what? She said talk to your own attorney. Not about me, about your own interests. Ask her to request the financial disclosures from your father's business for the past 8 years. All of them. Your attorney can make that request independently. Silence. Delia said, why 8 years? Eleanor said, because that's when something started. I don't have all of it yet, but I will. A long pause. Then Delia said, are you okay? Eleanor looked around Vera's kitchen, at the wood stove, at the brown bottle of floor soap on the counter, at the window and the dark outside it, and the lower fields she couldn't see anymore but knew were there. She said, I'm better than I expected to be, and she meant it, precisely and without performance. She meant it. Diana arrived on Saturday morning in a sensible car with a document case and the focused expression of someone who has decided what a situation requires and is moving toward it without ceremony. Eleanor met her at the door. They sat at Vera's kitchen table, the window open, the sound of the lower fields coming in on the October air. Walt Briggs was working on the porch roof, and the sound of his work came and went at the edges of their conversation, which Eleanor found oddly steadying. Something being fixed, while something else was being examined. Eleanor laid out all 4 documents in the order she had found them. Diana read each one with the careful attention of someone for whom the specific language of a document is never incidental. She read Vera's letter twice. She read the geological assessment 3 times, which told Eleanor something about the assessment that the assessment itself had already told her. When Diana set the last document down, she did not say anything for a moment. Then she looked at Eleanor. She said Vera traced both acquisition attempts to Gordon. Eleanor said yes. Diana said, and she did this 6.5 years ago, while he was still actively approaching her through intermediaries. Yes. Diana said the land trust she established means the property cannot be transferred, sold, or encumbered without your direct written consent, regardless of what any family court proceeding produces. Eleanor said he could not have gotten to it through the divorce. Diana said not through any legal means. No, she said, which means the locked office. Eleanor said, which means the locked office. They looked at each other. Diana said he was building toward a moment where he could manage your consent directly, through persuasion or through pressure, and the filing disrupted his timeline. Eleanor thought about the proposal document, her name on a signature line, prepared 18 months ago, before she had called Diana, before she had made the decision she had been building toward, before any of it. He had been further along in his plan than she had been in hers. Until she wasn't. Diana opened her document case and removed a folder. She said the discovery from the office has been producing more than I initially indicated. I wanted to see the Vera documents before I walked you through the rest of it. Eleanor said, "Show me." Diana laid it out. It was more than Eleanor had expected, and less than she should have been surprised by. Correspondence between Gordon and both acquisition companies going back 8 years. Meridian Land Acquisitions and Crestfield Resources, both of which had been incorporated in Delaware with minimal public footprint. Both of which, when traced, dissolved back to a single beneficial owner. A business account, separate from every account Eleanor had known about. Opened 8 years ago, 12 months before the first approach to Vera. Funded through Gordon's consulting firm, through a series of invoicing structures that a forensic accountant described in the report Diana had commissioned as designed to obscure rather than to document. Used over 8 years to pay Patricia Ould, was not on this list, but 2 other researchers were. Environmental consultants, both of whom had conducted independent assessments of the Harlan County property, both without Eleanor's knowledge or consent. One of the assessments conducted 4 years ago, the same year Vera died, overlapped almost exactly in timing with the period after Vera's funeral. When Gordon had walked the lower fields for an hour and a half, with a man he introduced as a business contact who happened to be nearby. Eleanor thought about that afternoon, about being occupied with the arrangements and the relatives and the grief, about not paying attention to what Gordon was doing in the lower fields. She paid attention to it now, and the proposal document, which Diana had already described, which was worse in its specifics than the initial description had suggested, because the proposal document was not simply a draft. It was a completed acquisition structure. Legal language, exhibits, mineral rights, maps, transfer terms, royalty arrangements. Everything in place, everything ready, requiring only one thing: Eleanor's signature, which she had never given, which he had printed on the line anyway 18 months ago, waiting for the moment when he could get it from her. Diana said what he was building was a pathway to those 200 acres that went through you, and only through you, because the land is in your name alone, and the trust structure Vera established made any other pathway impossible. He needed your signature to proceed legally, she said, and when Vera kept refusing to sell, he was waiting for her to die and for the property to pass to you. At which point, he believed he could manage your consent through the marriage. Manage your consent through the marriage? Eleanor sat with that phrase. She said it quietly, just to hear it out loud. Diana said the fraud filing I'm preparing will be based on the forged proposal document, the undisclosed business account, and the unauthorized environmental assessments conducted on your property without consent. Each of these is independently actionable. Together, they represent a pattern of conduct that a judge is going to find difficult to characterize as anything other than deliberate. Eleanor said Vera made sure the land was protected before she died. Diana said she did. She said she made sure the trust was in place. She made sure the research was documented. She made sure you would have everything you needed when you needed it. Eleanor looked at the 4 documents on the kitchen table. The letters and the assessment and the trust confirmation and the photograph she still had not opened. She said she did all of this without telling me, without changing anything about how she treated Gordon, without giving him any indication that she knew. Diana said, which meant he spent years operating on the assumption that the land was still unprotected, that the only obstacle was Vera's refusal to sell, and that once Vera was gone and the land passed to you, the obstacle was gone too. Eleanor said he didn't know about the trust. Diana said if he had known about the trust, he would never have spent 8 years building toward a signature. He would have found a different approach or abandoned the project entirely. Eleanor said Vera never gave him anything to find. Diana said no, she didn't. They sat for a moment. Walt was working on the porch roof. The sound of it came in through the window. Steady, purposeful, something being put right. Diana said, Eleanor, I want to talk about what comes next. Eleanor said I want to restore the house first. Diana looked at her. She said before anything else happens, before we talk about the fraud filing and the asset structure and the licensing conversations, I want the porch roof done and the north face resided and the windows replaced. I want the house the way Vera would have kept it if she'd had the time. Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the right first step. Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at the lower fields, at the 200 acres that a man had spent 8 years trying to reach by going around her, at the land that had been sitting here waiting. For her, specifically, since before she had understood what she was waiting for. Walt Briggs finished the porch roof on a Wednesday. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the change in sound. The rhythm of hammering that had been the background of her mornings for 2 weeks suddenly stopping, replaced by quiet. And then Walt's boots on the new boards, testing them the way you test something you built yourself with a particular kind of attention that is also a kind of pride. She brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch. Walt accepted his without ceremony and stood beside her, looking at the roofline. He said that'll hold 20 years. She looked at it, the new boards flush and even. The roofline straight again, the way it had been when Vera was alive and the house was being looked after. She said Vera would approve. He said she was particular about this porch, said her grandmother built it and she wasn't going to let it fall down on her watch. Eleanor looked at the boards under her feet. 3 generations of women had stood on this porch, had swept it and repaired it and looked out from it at the lower fields, going through all their seasons. She was the 4th, and she had let it get to the point of partial collapse before she came back to it. She was back now. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She was back now. Walt finished his coffee and went to start on the north face siding. Eleanor went inside and called Diana. The fraud filing had been submitted 3 weeks after Diana's visit to Harlan County. Diana had described the document in the measured language she always used, precise, without dramatization. Because the facts were dramatic enough on their own, and Diana understood that overstating them would only give Gordon's attorney something to push against. Gordon's attorney was a man named Philip Garrett, who had a reputation for aggressive procedural maneuvering and who had filed 3 separate objections in the first 2 weeks after the fraud complaint was submitted. Each objection had been reviewed. Each had been overruled. The business account was frozen pending investigation. Gordon's consulting firm had suspended operations. Not closed. Suspended. His remaining clients had heard enough through the proceedings to begin asking questions he could not answer cleanly, and several had quietly moved their business elsewhere while they waited to see how things resolved. His professional license was under review by the state board. Diana reported all of this without emphasis. Just facts. Just the shape of what was happening. Eleanor listened, and took notes in her narrow-ruled notebook and asked the questions she needed to ask, and got off the phone and went back to work. Because that was what she did. She worked on the house every day alongside Walt and his crew. Not supervising, actually working. She had never been afraid of physical work. Had grown up watching Vera approach every task the same way. With her whole attention and without making a production of it, she scraped paint on the south wall for 3 days until her arms ached and her hands were stiff in the mornings, and she felt underneath the aching something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood as it. She replaced the cracked ground floor window herself with Walt's instruction. He talked her through it and stood back and let her do it. When it was done, he looked at the seal and the fit and said nothing, which meant it was right. She cleared the overgrown section of the east yard with a brush cutter she bought at the Harlan County hardware store. The woman behind the counter, whose name was Bertie, had become a reliable source of recommendations ranging from Walt Briggs to the best place to get a hot breakfast to the specific variety of Kentucky limestone used in the foundation pointing. Bertie had an opinion about everything. Most of her opinions were correct. Delia called every few days now. The calls had changed. Not suddenly. Gradually, the way things actually change. The first week after the fraud filing, Delia had called with a quality of careful neutrality, the tone of someone trying to hold multiple versions of a story in her head simultaneously and not yet ready to set any of them down. Then she had spoken to her own attorney. Then she had requested the financial disclosures from Gordon's business independently, as Eleanor had suggested. And then she had called on a Tuesday evening, and there had been something different in her voice. Quieter. Heavier. The particular quality of someone who has seen something they cannot unsee and is in the early stages of understanding what that means. She didn't say much that call. Just asked how the house was coming along, asked about Walt, asked whether Eleanor had found the rose catalog Vera kept in the cedar chest. Eleanor had not found it yet. She went back to the chest that evening and looked more carefully and found it tucked into the folder of property documents. A seed and plant catalog from 2020. Vera's pencil marks beside certain varieties of climbing roses. Small checks. The marks of someone planning a spring planting that she had not lived to do. Eleanor photographed the marked pages. She ordered every variety Vera had checked. The roofing was done. The windows were done. The north face siding was done by the 3rd week of October, and the house looked different from the outside now. Still old, still weathered in the way a house in the Kentucky hill country is supposed to be weathered, but tended, looked after. The kind of different that comes from attention rather than replacement. Walt walked the perimeter with her on the last day of October and pronounced the exterior work complete. He said, "Foundation pointing will cure by Thanksgiving. You'll want to have the heating system serviced before then." She said, "I'll call the service company this week." He said, "Bertie's brother does heating. Tell her I said to call him directly." She wrote it down. He said, "You're going to want someone to look at the lower fields before spring. Fence line's been down along the eastern edge for a while. Something's been grazing in there." Eleanor looked out at the lower fields, at the 200 acres she had not yet walked since she arrived. She had looked at them from the kitchen window every morning, had seen them in the geological assessment maps, and in the acquisition documents, and in the photographs in the Lexington Research Report. But she had not walked them. She said, "I'll get to the lower fields." Walt looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been working alongside a person for several weeks and has formed a fairly accurate assessment of who that person is. He said, "Bless that land ran off a lot of bad offers over the years. Vera used to say it knew who it belonged to." Eleanor said, "Vera said a lot of things I'm only now understanding." He said she was a woman worth understanding. He loaded his truck, drove down the gravel track, and the quiet came back around the house the way it did every evening now, deeper than city quiet, full of things that were alive. Delia arrived on a Friday evening in late October. No warning. Eleanor looked out the kitchen window and saw headlights coming down the gravel track and did not know who it was until the car stopped and the door opened, and Delia got out with a bag over her shoulder and a jacket that was not warm enough for Kentucky in late October. Eleanor went to the door. Delia looked at the house, at the straight porch roofline, at the new siding on the north face, at the windows clean and sealed and reflecting the last of the evening light. She said, "It looks good." Eleanor said, "Come inside. There's soup." They ate at Vera's kitchen table. Delia had her father's directness and her great-grandmother's hands, and Eleanor's tendency to go quiet when something was heavy, which meant dinner was a quiet affair, with occasional sentences dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Delia said, "I looked at the business records." Eleanor said, "I know." Delia said, "8 years, Mom." Eleanor said, "Yes." She said he was doing this for 8 years while we were... She stopped. While we were having Christmases, Eleanor thought. While we were driving to Delia's college graduation and attending Margaret's retirement dinner and sitting in this same configuration at the kitchen table at home with the fruit bowl empty because Gordon never thought to fill it. While 38 years were happening in the foreground. She said, "I know." Delia said, "I don't know how you're this calm." Eleanor considered this. She said, "I'm not calm. I'm clear. There's a difference." Delia looked at her across the table with the expression Eleanor recognized from when she was 7 years old working out a problem. The particular focused attention that meant she was deciding something. She said, "What can I do?" Eleanor said, "There's a rose catalog in the cedar chest. Vera had things marked for spring planting. I ordered everything she checked. When they come in April, I could use help putting them in along the south fence." Delia looked at her. She said, "That's it. That's all you're going to ask me for." Eleanor said, "That's what I'm going to ask you for right now. There will be other things later. But that's the one I want first." Delia said, "Okay." She said it quietly, like a door finally settling into its frame. They did the dishes together, and Delia slept in the front room on the pull-out settee that had been in that room since Eleanor could remember. And in the morning, they drove to the hardware store, and Bertie sold them 2 additional brush cutters and expressed strong opinions about the eastern fence line, and Delia bought a warmer jacket from the rack near the door, and Bertie approved of the choice. Delia stayed 3 days and helped Eleanor clear the overgrown section along the eastern fence line and rehang the gate that had come off its upper hinge sometime in the past 4 years, and driven the truck along the perimeter road Walt had pointed out so Eleanor could see the full boundary of the property for the first time since she was a child. They did not talk about Gordon during those 3 days, not because the subject was forbidden, because there were other things to attend to, and because the two of them were enough alike to understand that some things are better processed in motion than in conversation. On the last morning before Delia drove back, They stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the lower fields in the early light. Delia said, "It's something, isn't it?" Eleanor said, "It is." Delia said, "All this time." "Right here." Eleanor said, "All this time." Gordon came on a Sunday in November. Eleanor saw the car from the kitchen window at 8:30 in the morning. A rental with Tennessee plates coming down the gravel track too slowly for someone who knew the road. She watched it park beside her car, watched Gordon get out. He stood beside the rental and looked at the house. She could see him taking it in, even from the kitchen. The porch roof repaired and straight. The new siding on the north face. The windows clean. The yard cleared back to the tree line where Walt and his crew had spent 3 days in October with brush cutters. The property as it had been when Vera was alive and the house was being attended to. Gordon had last seen this property from satellite images and survey documents. He had never seen it like this. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. She was aware of what she felt, and she was aware that what she felt was not fear. Not anger, either, though the anger was present underneath, as it had been for weeks acknowledged and set aside, because it was not useful right now. What she felt was something closer to the particular clarity of a situation that has finally become exactly as simple as it always was. She went to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch before he reached the steps. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her. Not with satisfaction, simply as an observation. The particular ease he had always carried the quality of a man who moves through rooms as though the rooms were arranged for him was gone. What remained was someone who had driven a long way to a difficult conversation and was not certain yet how to begin it. He said, "Ellie." She said, "I wondered when you'd come." She did not move from the porch, did not step aside, did not offer coffee or gesture toward the door. Stood on the boards she had swept clean and looked at him in the flat November light. He talked. She let him because she had always been a good listener and because she wanted to understand the shape of what he had come to say before she responded to it. He talked about the investigation, the frozen accounts, the pressure from remaining clients who had heard enough to start asking questions. He talked about the consulting firm, the license review, the attorney fees, the way things were moving, and then, after all of that, he got to what he had actually come for. He said, "The mineral rights on that land are worth more than you understand, Ellie. I know that's not how it looks right now. I know the documents look." He paused. He said, "I made mistakes in how I approached this. I know that, but what I found under those lower fields could set you up for the rest of your life. Both of us. I was trying to build something for us. I handled it wrong, but the underlying intention..." He stopped, looked at her, tried something with his eyes that had worked on her before. In restaurants, and in meetings with contractors, and in 38 years of moments when she had needed to believe that the man across from her was someone she could trust. It did not work now. He said, "Here's what I'm proposing. You sign the mineral rights agreement, the one my team prepared. It's a fair structure. Good royalty terms. I walk away from every asset dispute in Scottsdale. The house, the accounts, everything. You keep all of it. You sign one document, and this whole thing ends." Silence. The lower fields were behind her, just beyond the line of the house. She could feel them, the way you feel a thing you have been thinking about for long enough that it has taken up permanent residence in your chest. She said, "Wait here." She went inside. She went to the kitchen table where the folder had been sitting since Diana's visit. She picked it up and went back to the porch and held it out to him. She said, "Read the first page." He took it, opened it. The first page was Vera's letter, the one with his name at the bottom, underlined once. He read slowly. She watched him without looking away. Watched the particular quality of a man who has spent 8 years believing he was the only one in possession of the full picture, coming to understand for the first time that someone else had been looking at the same picture from the other side and had seen it clearly. He looked up. He said she knew. Eleanor said she knew from 6.5 years before she died. She hired a researcher. She traced both companies back to you. She said nothing, changed nothing, declined every approach, and put everything she had found in an envelope at the bottom of a cedar chest with my legal name on it. He said nothing. She said she established a protective land trust 5 years before she died. The property cannot be transferred or encumbered without my direct written consent, regardless of any other legal proceeding. You could not have gotten to this land through the divorce even if I hadn't found out. The trust was already there. Vera made sure of that. He looked at the letter in his hands. She said she also made sure I had everything I needed to understand what you had been doing. The researcher's findings, the geological assessment she commissioned herself, the trust documents, all of it in that chest, waiting for the moment I needed it. He said, Ellie. She said, don't. Just that. One word, said quietly, without edge, with the particular authority of someone who has finished a conversation and is simply waiting for the other person to understand that it's finished. She held out her hand for the folder. He gave it back. She said, I spent 38 years trusting you. I trusted you with my time and my attention and the shape of my entire adult life. I was the person who managed this household and raised our daughter and supported your business in the years when it needed supporting, and believed that what we were building together was actually being built together. You used all of that to work toward taking the one thing my grandmother spent the last years of her life making sure you couldn't have. She looked at him. She said, I want you to understand that I understand that fully. Not as an accusation, as a fact. I understand what happened. I understand the shape of it now, and I want you to know that. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of doors. She said you should go. Not unkindly, simply clearly. The way you close a window that has been left open too long. Not in anger. Just because it is time. He stood for another moment. Then he walked back to the rental car and got in and sat with the engine off for a while. She could see him through the windshield from the porch. She did not look away, did not soften, did not add anything to what she had already said, because there was nothing to add. After a while, he started the engine, drove back down the gravel track, turned onto the county road, and was gone. The quiet of the property came back around her, the way it always did. The birds in the tree line, the sound of something in the lower fields, the particular November light coming flat and pale across the hills. Eleanor stood on the porch for a long time. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and sat at Vera's kitchen table and took the fourth document out of the envelope. The photograph. She had been putting it off, not from fear exactly, from something more like the instinct to save what you sense is going to be the most important thing. The way you save the last good piece of something without quite admitting to yourself that's what you're doing. She looked at it now, black and white, a child running through open grass. The lower fields, she recognized them even in black and white, even in an era before she had the geological assessment to tell her what those fields were made of. The child was maybe 8 years old. Dark hair, mouth open, clearly laughing at something, or maybe just at the running, at the motion, at the particular joy of moving fast across a field with no particular destination. The child was Eleanor. She did not remember the photograph being taken, did not remember that specific day or that specific run across that specific field. but she recognized herself with the certainty of someone looking at an old photograph and understanding immediately before the mind has time to process it, before anything except recognition. That's me. She turned the photograph over. Vera's handwriting on the back. 2 sentences. The penmanship slightly younger than the letters in the cedar chest. Written before the years had made Vera's hand more deliberate. She already knows where she belongs. She just needs to find her way back. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and held the photograph and did not try to manage what she felt. She let it come, all of it. The grief of 38 years and the anger she had been setting to one side for weeks, and the specific tenderness of being known by someone who had loved you long enough to understand you better than you understood yourself. The grief of losing Vera, the grief of the marriage, the strange and complicated relief of a thing that has been hidden finally being seen. She cried in the kitchen of her grandmother's house in Harlan County, Kentucky, on a Sunday in November. Not quietly, not tidily. The way you cry when you have been not crying for long enough that when it finally comes, there is nothing left to manage it with. She sat at the kitchen table and let it happen. And when it was done, she washed her face at the kitchen sink and made tea and sat back down and looked at the photograph for a long time. She already knows where she belongs. She just needs to find her way back. The kettle had gone cold by the time she called Delia. Delia answered on the first ring. Eleanor said he came today. Delia said, I know. He called me after. Eleanor said, what did he say? Delia said not much. He said you weren't interested in a resolution. Eleanor said I found a resolution. It just wasn't his. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are you okay? Eleanor looked at the photograph on the table, at the child running through the lower fields in the November that was no longer November, that was some summer decades ago, when the world was simple and the land was just land, and nobody had yet explained to her what she was standing on. She said, I cried. Delia said, good. She said, I'm going to be all right. Delia said, I know you are. I always knew you were. She said the Rose catalog. Can you still come in April? Delia said I already asked for the time off. Eleanor said good. She set the phone down and looked around Vera's kitchen, at the wood stove, at the brown bottle of floor soap still on the counter because she had not found it in herself to put it away. At the window above the sink where the evening was coming in, now the light going the color it went, in Kentucky in November, a gray-blue that was specific to this place and that she had not seen in decades and had missed without knowing she was missing it. The fraud case concluded on a Thursday in February. Diana called at 9 in the morning. Eleanor was in the side yard pulling dead growth back from the section along the east fence where she planned to add the rose plantings in spring. Her hands were cold inside the garden gloves. Her breath was visible in the February air. She answered and stood very still and listened. Diana gave her the outcome in the measured language she always used. Significant financial penalties. A civil judgment against Gordon that would take years to satisfy. His consulting license suspended pending the outcome of a separate professional review board process. The fraud findings on the forged proposal document had carried particular weight with the court, because the documentation trail was complete. Vera's letter tracing both acquisition companies back to Gordon, the 8-year business account, the unauthorized environmental assessments, the forged signature, all of it documented, all of it in order. All of it exactly as Vera had intended when she hired the Lexington researcher 6.5 years ago and began building a record that could not be argued with. Diana said the trail Vera built was what made this case. There was nothing to dispute because she had anticipated every possible dispute. Eleanor said she was thorough. Diana said she was extraordinary. Eleanor looked out at the lower fields from where she was standing, the February grass pale and flat, the tree line bare, the land looking exactly like what it was. Kentucky hill country in the last weeks of winter, waiting for spring the way it had always waited. She said, "What comes next?" Diana said, "The geological reassessment is complete. Dr. Aldous Finn's team submitted the final report last week," Eleanor said, and Diana said the findings confirm what Vera's survey identified 6 years ago and add to it. The rare earth concentrations in the lower fields are significant. The specific mineral composition has become more strategically important in the years since the first survey. Domestic sourcing of battery-grade elements has moved from theoretical priority to active policy. What was valuable 6 years ago is now something the market is actively looking for. She said Dr. Finn used the word substantial twice and the word uncommon once. Eleanor walked to the fence line and looked out over the lower fields. 200 acres. Her great-great-grandparents had farmed this ground, had not known what was under it any more than they had needed to, had just worked it and kept it and passed it forward. And Vera had walked it every morning for 40 years and had understood somewhere in those walks that the land knew things it hadn't been asked yet, and had protected it and had passed it forward. And here it was, still here. She said, "I want to explore licensing." Diana said, "I expected you to say that." She said the same structure we've discussed. The land stays in my name. The mineral rights are leased, not sold. Royalties over a defined term with renewal options I control. Any operational requirements must include land restoration standards. Non-negotiable. Diana said, "I'll begin making inquiries." 3 companies made serious contact over the following 8 weeks. Eleanor met with representatives of each one at the property, not in Scottsdale, not in an office, on the land, because she had decided that the way a company's representative behaved when they were standing on the land itself was more informative than anything they said in a conference room. The first company sent 2 men in city shoes who kept looking at their phones and referred to the property as the asset. She thanked them for their time. The second company sent a woman named Constance Pruitt, who had grown up in eastern Tennessee and who walked the lower fields with Eleanor for 2 hours without looking at her phone once, and who said, standing at the eastern fence line looking toward the tree line, "You can feel where the ground changes. Right here. Can you feel it?" Eleanor said she could. She had not been certain before. Now she was. The third company was larger, and their terms were more aggressive, and their projections were more impressive, and their representative was extremely confident in the way of someone who has closed many deals and considers confidence to be part of the product. Eleanor thanked him for his time. She chose the second company. She chose Constance Pruitt's company because Constance had stood at the eastern fence line and felt the ground change and said so. Because the operational plan her company had submitted included specific land restoration requirements that went beyond what Diana had required. Because when Eleanor had asked what would happen to the surface land during the extraction process, Constance had answered without consulting notes, without pausing to calculate the right answer. She had simply answered as someone who had already thought about it. The licensing agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in April at Diana's office in Scottsdale. Eleanor drove back to Kentucky the following day. She did not stop in Scottsdale longer than she needed to. She had sublet the apartment she had moved into after the hotel. She had arranged for her personal items from 4 Meridian Court to be retrieved and stored. She had handled what needed to be handled from Harlan County and would continue to do so. The house on Meridian Court was an asset in the divorce settlement now. A number in a column, nothing more. The Kentucky house was something else entirely. Delia arrived on the last weekend of April. She came with the right shoes this time and a pair of work gloves and a flat of compost from the Harlan County Garden Center that Bertie had recommended. She had called ahead to confirm the order, and Bertie had set it aside with a note that said for Vera's granddaughter. They planted the roses on Saturday afternoon, working along the south fence line the way Vera had clearly intended them to go, based on the catalog marks and the measurements Eleanor had taken from the old fence post holes that were still visible in the ground where a previous planting had been. Someone had grown roses here before, long before Vera's time. The ground remembered. They worked through the afternoon without much conversation. That was fine. That was how they were. Always had been. Delia had inherited from somewhere the understanding that you can be completely in someone's company without filling the air between you with words. The light was changing by the time they finished, going the color it went over the eastern ridge in late April. Something between gold and gray that Eleanor had no specific word for and had never needed one because you knew it when you saw it. Delia stood up and pulled off her work gloves and looked at the fence line, at the newly planted roses, small and tentative and entirely alive. She said Nan would like this. Eleanor said she planned it. We're just following the instructions she left. Delia said she left a lot of instructions. Eleanor said she knew what she was doing. Delia looked at her. She said, Mom, I need to say something. Eleanor waited. Delia said I believed him, for a while. I want you to know that I know that. I heard what he was saying, and I thought... She stopped. Tried again. She said I should have asked better questions sooner. Eleanor said you asked them when you were ready. Delia said you never doubted me, even when I was... Eleanor said, you're my daughter. Simple, without performance. The way you say the thing that is simply and completely true. Delia looked at the roses, at the lower fields beyond them catching the last of the light. She said, you look like yourself. Eleanor considered this. She said, I think I am myself. For the first time in a long time. Possibly for the first time since I was a child, running through those fields, not knowing what I was running on. Delia said she knew, didn't she? Nan knew even then. Eleanor thought about the photograph, the child with her mouth open, laughing, the lower fields in summer. And on the back in Vera's younger handwriting, 2 sentences that had been waiting in the dark at the bottom of a cedar chest for the right moment to be read. She already knows where she belongs. She just needs to find her way back. She said yes. She always knew. The first royalty payment arrived on a Friday morning in May. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with the window open and the sound of the south fence coming in on the morning air. The small sounds of something alive and growing that had not been there 2 weeks ago. She read the figure on the statement once, then again, giving it the attention it deserved without dramatizing it, because it was significant, and because Vera had known it would be significant, or something like it, from the moment she commissioned that geological assessment 6 years ago and read the findings and placed them in an envelope at the bottom of a cedar chest. Eleanor called Delia. Delia answered on the second ring. Eleanor said the first payment came. Delia said and. Eleanor said your great-grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. A pause. Delia said she always did. Eleanor set the phone down, sat at Vera's kitchen table in the morning light coming through the kitchen window. The window Vera had stood at every morning. The table where Vera had drunk her coffee and written her letters and made her careful plans. The same table where Eleanor had eaten breakfast as a child during those long summer visits when the days were unscheduled and the land was just land, and she had run through the lower fields in the afternoons, not knowing. The south fence roses were out there, small still, but alive. The lower fields were out there, the same 200 acres that had been there through all of it, through Vera's 40 years of morning walks, through the approaches and the declined offers and the 8 years of a plan that had believed it was winning, through a cedar chest and a sealed envelope and a photograph of a child running. Still there, still exactly what it had always been. Eleanor picked up her coffee, let the morning come through the window, and sat in Vera's kitchen in the May light, and understood for the first time and completely what her grandmother had been telling her. Not with the letter, not with the geological assessment or the trust documents or the researcher's report, with the photograph, with the 2 sentences on the back of it. She already knows where she belongs. She just needs to find her way back. Eleanor looked out the window at the south fence line, at the lower fields beyond it, at the ridge in the distance turning the particular color it turned in the Kentucky morning when the light was new and the day had not yet made any demands. She was 62 years old. She was sitting at her grandmother's table. She was home,